welcome to our Brave Conversation Starter and today's topic of identity and inclusion. I'm Shaleen and I'm at Brookhouse School in Kenya.
I'm Jackson and I'm at the Ride School on the Isle of Wight. Over the past few weeks, students across the Round Square community have interviewed 14 keynote conversationalists from different backgrounds and areas of expertise to find out where they think we should start our discussions today.
Let's hear what our interviewers asked and what some of our speakers had to say about identity and inclusion.
What or where do you draw your sense of identity and belonging? And in what aspect of our identity do you think defines it?
I think identity, cultural identity, is really, it's more of a function of your self-reflection and your self-perception and where you see yourself connected to. So there are times when my cultural identity can be very Japanese in many ways, many different contexts. At a time, I could be told I'm very American. In other instances, I could be told, wow, you're sort of a citizen of the world. Look at your life, look at your work and such. So cultural identity is quite fluid in that sense, and it's quite contextual. And it's very much something that you sort of own as an individual.
So we are all a collection of the societal cues that are around us, whether we want it to be or not, okay? And that absolutely impacts our interiority. For the vast majority of people, they will function within the sum of their parts. So if they appear to have the map of Africa on their face, or the map of the European continent on their face, they're going to act in accordance with that. They will perform in accordance with that sort of scripting, what the ancestors have given us. And there it is, and while I still want to honor some of that, in terms of the ancestral travels and what's been done to get all of us here, to get all of us embodied. But the thing is, that's the thing. Us being born and incarnated, that's the starting point. The left off point is that the ancestors collectively got us here. But now that we are here, we then process those societal cues in the way that you've alluded to in such a way that ultimately will make sense for us. I think that our identities absolutely can transcend that of the societal limitation, no doubt. For me, it's just what felt right. It feels right. It's the shape of the psyche of the soul. It's like it's the right pair of jeans that you put on. It's just the shape of the way that the psyche is mapped out.
I always have a problem when you talk about, so where are you from? And I said, well, from this planet, as you are. Where else can I come from? Can't see any other place that I could come from. And so I hope that, one day we move away from this so-called natural, this nation states to the planetary perspective.
As I was born in Germany, I went to boarding school for a bit in the UK. I have an American mother and I studied in the States. And then I ended up coming to the Netherlands for work. And when people say, well, which culture do you think you belong to? I don't feel that I belong to any one of them. I feel that I live currently in a country that I like, but I'm not Dutch. I don't feel Dutch. And Dutch, I feel like an expat. So wherever I go, I actually have this feeling of being an expat, which is great for a curious person because it gets you really interested in how do people do things here and why do they, what do they joke about here? It's really interesting to travel between cultures and watch what people joke about is so different. And the whole cultural context is so different. But the way I've solved that for myself is I am part of a global community.
What I feel privileged about having grown up in Iran and then Cobham and then the life that I've led is that in a way I've sat in multiple seats. I've sat in the seat of privilege and being an elite in a country. I've sat in the seat of being, basically like refugees coming out of Iran and not knowing where we go, of having to be an immigrant and so forth. So it allows me, or it's like a little superpower. It allows me to understand things from different perspectives.
So, I think in today's world, particularly, if you think of people who are like yourself, are very much online and connected in so many ways, cultural identity is quite fluid, and in a way, the internet and other social media enable you to kind of identify with different groups and identities and such. Citizenship is harder. It's a legal principle, and it's something you can be born with or you can apply for, but it is not, you don't have agency. You have to apply for it and be given to you. Community, though, I think is the most meaningful, and it's also challenging because you have to give back to the community at the same time, and as well as be accepted by that community. But it's actually, I think, the place where both your sense of being a citizen and your cultural identity come together often in the communities that you're part of.
What brave conversations should we be having about identity and inclusion?
We've got to be able to be confrontational. And by being confrontational, I don't mean violence. Confrontation is not, I think sometimes there's been a misunderstanding of what confrontation means. Confrontation means that you confront ideas with ideas. You confront you confront issues instead of waiting for them to sort themselves out. So there are so many things that we need to embrace, that we need to confront, that we need to challenge. And so I know that you, as young leaders, you are thinking about these things. You're thinking about inequality in terms of how people are treated, whether we're talking about gender inequality, we're talking about racial and ethnic inequality, or whatever inequalities that's out there, we need to confront that. There are issues about hate. Right now, we're talking about Asian hate, and we're talking about different kinds of hate that's going on. We've got to confront that. We've got to confront it with the truth. We've got to confront it with love. We've got to confront it with values.
We need to have open discussions about what is that divides us, because as a species, we are the same. But I think what has differentiated us is this very intelligent organ that we call the brain. And we have set up these things that you are different from me because, hey, you have a different color than me, or a different religion, or different ideology. So we need to have these open dialogues. But one should not be afraid to say that, because again, these days we are afraid to say what we really feel, because it might be not the right thing. But let's have it out there, and let's not make value judgments, but have the dialogue. And you know what? When you start having these open discussions and dialogues, you sort of see we are not so different after all. We have the same fears, we have the same aspirations, and we all want the same things: security, peace, and a stable livelihood.
Yeah, I think let us start having the conversation, but have the conversation from an honest place of, we don't think we know as much as we know, right? I mean, if you think about how people generally gain knowledge and how knowledge is typically dispersed, the things that we generally know about are the things that are generally very prevalent. But interestingly enough, with disability, although it is prevalent as it is, and there's different types of people living with different types of disabilities, it's the one knowledge space where not a lot has been done to actually bring it to the fore. And so there's very little understanding about concepts around disability and how you navigate it as a person living with it, or how you interact with it as a person who's just experiencing it by living with people who have disabilities, right? And so I think, one, let's have the conversation from that place of honesty. I think what I found at a personal level helps to bring authenticity to the discussion is just my ability to be vulnerable about my own things.
I think, race should not be like, I'm particularly talking about race because it has come up a lot, in the last few months, with, organizations or programs such as like Black Lives Matter. I think we should start talking about our identities, in our schools, in our communities, with our friends. We should genuinely be interested to find out about people that are different to us and their culture, how they do things, in a way that people also like feel safe. They feel included. So what this would mean would be like in class, if you see that your classmate of another color feels excluded from conversation, let's think of ways to like bring them into like the conversation, whether it's your colleague. So I think that's how we can start with brave conversations. That's how we can start to begin the conversations.
But I think lack of knowledge is one of the things that perpetuates or can create racism or even exacerbate racism and disability discrimination. And I think the whole reason for that is because people generally tend to, one, isolate what they don't know, and more overtly, they tend to be afraid of what they don't know. And it's, whether this is a normal thing or not, I don't know. But I think we miss the power in knowledge when we don't even give ourselves the opportunity to interrogate it or to even ask questions. And these questions don't always have to be very brave, very intense, very like heartfelt questions.
What do you think creates, causes, or perpetuates racism or disability discrimination in society?
There's this notion that equality, all equality, racial equality for people with disabilities, gender equality, and people from the LGBTQ community, for all of us to have equality. I think people see it as a zero-sum game. And what I mean by that is they believe that in order for one group to progress, another group has to go backwards. And when we look at it like that, we're never going to progress. So there's all this worry, well, if the Black and Asian community are doing really well, then the white community are not going to do well. And it's just this nonsensical view. And I think in order for us to get past that, we have to stop looking at people for their because of the color of their skin, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, or because of if they have a physical disability. We just have to look at people for who they are.
I think we need to be having more discussions on intersectionality. A lot of academicians know that term, but that's not necessarily household term. Critical race theory, for better or for worse, is now a household term and is becoming global. Woke, being woke, is effectively international right now. But I think we need more discussions on intersectionality. So that means that we can discuss how someone can be the opposite of everything. They can appear as Black and male, but identify as white, female. They can appear as white and male, but identify as a Filipina female, like Jadu. I think looking at identities that perhaps have never been thought of or reported about is what should be a part of the conversation. And just really starting to cross-pollinate. I mean, you've got, I think, more than 8 billion people on the planet. And so looking at all sorts of non-normative identities, I think, is just critical.
I think the other thing, whether directly or indirectly creates or causes and perpetuates racism or disability discrimination, is this constant need that we have that if it's not mine, it's not right, or if it's not right, then it's wrong. So as a Black person, if I have this continuous sense that my Blackness is the superior thing, it never necessarily occurs to me to think, oh, whiteness is just different. My natural inkling is to then assume whiteness is wrong if my Blackness is right. And that's not, we can't afford to live like that as people, because the moment you keep polarizing these things that far out and insisting that things exist in binary boxes, you're never going to give yourself the opportunity to even open up to something different. So if Blackness is right and whiteness must be wrong as a function of that, there's something fundamentally very wrong with that. I have to be prepared to say, while I think Blackness is right, whiteness is right too. or whiteness is different. At best, let me say that, right? Or if ableism is right, then a person living with a disability is just different, not wrong. And because the moment we take it into a right or wrong conversation, we tend to reject things that we think are wrong. And so we then don't give ourselves the opportunity to then fully understand what they are.
One issue that is really important is to teach in schools multi-perspective history. And by that, I mean, when I was growing up in England, British Empire, right, or Britishness, we didn't learn really about what was going on in India and what India gave to the empire. We didn't learn about what Iran and Iran's oil gave to the empire, right? Or what came from the Rift Valley in Kenya, or all the other ways in which the British Empire became the British Empire, and what the British took from these places, right? And it's not to say, oh, this is going against British values. No, it's to say we have leaders. These leaders are human. These leaders are not gods. They don't get everything right, right? And through the lens of history, you can see that, okay, Winston Churchill, for example, was great, maybe as the leader in World War II, but he was a terrible leader when it came to dealing with what was going on in India, or what was going on with Iran and the nationalization of oil and so forth. There is no harm in teaching that, in teaching this idea that our heroes are not entirely heroic and above humanity.
And we can't be afraid to criticize. We shouldn't be afraid to criticize what happened in the past. It's the only way that we can become a progressive society, because the truth is, I guarantee there were people who were criticizing what was happening at that time.
There's been a huge thing around the world about statues, and I'm always brought in and asked about that topic. And so there's two sides of that conversation. People are saying, well, we've got to protect our history, and we've got to do that. And then others say, but this history is very painful for some people, and it brings terrible memories. Even right here in Canada, we're having something of that nature right now, with the first Prime Minister, who was also responsible for atrocious decisions about that affected Indigenous people of Canada. And you can think of any country and you're going to find something similar. So the brave conversation is, how do we celebrate and have the history, but without hiding the other parts of the history? And so how do we have both? How do we say, this is who this person was, these were the good things and these were the bad things, and acknowledge both of them? And how do we do it in a way that moves us forward instead of just destroying the fabric of our society?
You talk about moving from diversity to inclusion. How can someone move from diversity to inclusion? What are the differences between diversity and inclusion? And what do diversity have that inclusion do not, or vice versa?
Diversity is about who is represented. So it's about bringing people that are different together. Whereas inclusion is about who is expected, who is respected, and who is accepted into that institution. So you can have people that are different, but if they don't make a contribution that changes the institution, they are not expected or respected or accepted, then you do not have inclusion. And so this is where we often find ourselves. We have diversity, but it hasn't translated into inclusion.
To me, inclusion is not just inclusion in terms of me because I'm a woman, or because I'm Muslim, or because I'm Black or brown, but because of the work that I do and the perspective that I bring and the experience that I bring to the table to solve that problem, right? And it's a transformative lens on inclusion.
But what often stands in the way from moving from diversity to inclusion is unconscious bias. And unconscious bias is something that we all have. And so what I often say to people is that you are biased, I am biased, We are all biased. The person sitting next to you is biased. All of us are biased. To be human is to be biased. And what does that mean? Biases are sort of like concepts or ideas or thoughts that we hold about people, whether they are true or false. And so the key is to understand how it shows up and then how to combat it and to sort of like manage it in a way that it doesn't lead to racism, it doesn't lead to sexism, it doesn't lead to homophobia, it doesn't lead to all of these isms that are negative for our society.
There's a lot of truth. There can be a lot of truth inside of a stereotype. I mean, I've seen a stat with human behavior that says that 93% of human behavior is predictable, and that's out of psychology. So I think that whether we realize it or not, I mean, we all are valid and worthy, but at the same time, perhaps we do have a lot more predictable behaviors as a collective than maybe people will want to readily admit or that they are even cognizant of. And so I think maybe that's where the stereotype becomes developed, or where that's born out of. It's just that when you're reduced to the point of absurdity, that's when the stereotype is the problem, when it muzzles the nuance. And so then that's where the archetype is valid. The archetype does allow for that. So I don't want to just limit anyone to, oh, so you're from this place, well then that means you like this. I mean, I wouldn't just want to leave it at that, even though there could be a good chance that it's true. But just let someone, give them a blank sheet of paper, if you will, proverbial blank piece of paper, and allow for them to fill it in and write their story. And inevitably they will do that, as we all do. So give them that opportunity. So that's what I say.
How do we celebrate not being the norm? Because people who represent the norm have never moved the dial on things concerning the world. It's always been the extraordinary people. It's always been the people that stuck out in a way where they had an extraordinary talent, but where they weren't always understood. So celebrating the extraordinariness, celebrating the differences is, I think, a really great breakout session to have.
That was a great introduction from our speakers to some discussion points around the topic of identity and inclusion. First, they talked about their own sense of identity or belonging, and whether it's a matter of fact or a matter of choice.
Then they discussed bravery, being brave enough to confront our own lack of knowledge or bias, and also brave enough to hear other people's opinions without getting too easily offended.
And then there's the question of history and heritage. Should we attempt to right the wrongs of our ancestors? And if so, where does that stop? Or should we be more accepting and learn from their mistakes? And is it right or wrong to judge history by modern standards? Lots to discuss on that one.
So now we're going to move to our Baraza breakout rooms to pick up the conversation there. We hope you enjoyed watching this film and look forward to sharing the next one with you tomorrow.